And so there is this inherent disparity in crime that needs to be controlled for. And that's where firearms come in, right? Firearms are, as many have said, the great equalizer. They let someone who is weak, somebody who's small in stature, defend themselves from someone who is stronger, is bigger, and against groups of people even. And so I see the right to own a gun as just an extension of, the right to fight back.
Welcome to the Kalos Center podcast. Welcome to another episode of the Kalos Center podcast. Our guest today is Christian ethicist Timothy Hsiao. Tim earned his BA and MA in philosophy at Florida State University. He served as assistant professor of philosophy, humanities, and criminal justice at University of Arkansas Grantham. And currently he is a research fellow at the University of Wyoming Firearms Research Center, while also working in local and federal law enforcement. Tim's scholarly work covers a wide array of ethical issues, including sexual ethics, environmental ethics, and criminal justice ethics. He also publishes in popular media, and his articles have appeared in such periodicals as Public Discourse, American Thinker, and The Federalist. So, Tim Hsiao, welcome to the Kalos Center podcast.
Appreciate you having me.
So, as I mentioned, in addition to your research, all the stuff that you do in philosophy and ethics in particular, you work in law enforcement. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I get a lot of questions about that, especially when other officers find out that, oh, you're also a college professor. Like, that doesn't go with law enforcement. But for me, teaching ethics, doing a lot of research on applied ethics, political philosophy topics, a lot of that overlaps with the criminal justice system. And I took a natural interest in that in my classroom discussions, in my lectures and research. And so this was several years ago. I reached out to one of my colleagues at the time who was a criminal justice professor. And I sort of asked her, what would it take for someone like me to get into law enforcement? Well, in Kansas and, many places where you have smaller populations, there are a lot of cities that hire part-time officers. And so while still teaching, I went through the police academy in the summer and I started working part-time in law enforcement. So I've been doing that since 2022. Depending on the week, I'll do 10, 20, sometimes even 30 hours. Most of it is just, driving around, patrol, doing traffic stops. I've actually gotten quite a bit of additional training in crisis intervention, DUI detection, and then I also contract right now for a federal agency moving inmates and illegal aliens via aircraft.
Wow. Exciting and important work. Thank you for your service. So let's start with the basics when it comes to ethics. Most of our listeners are not philosophers. So how would you define ethics? And what accounts for your special interest in the subject?
The most general definition I can give of ethics is the study of right and wrong, good and bad, how we make decisions about that. And within ethics, you have various sort of subcategories or subdisciplines. So normative ethics, meta-ethics, and applied ethics. My specialization is in applied ethics, which is sort of, moral reasoning as it pertains to specific controversial topics. Topics that, are often divisive, that dominate public discourse, like abortion, gun control, drug legalization. I guess what drew my interest towards that was, when I was in college, I went to college at Florida State University. And so the first semester in college, I took an ethics class. It was a gen ed requirement, and I really enjoyed it. But I was also exposed to a lot of different perspectives. And perspectives that, growing up in sort of a Christian environment, I'd heard of before, but I never actually directly interacted with. And so as someone who had really strong convictions about certain moral and political topics, I thought, well, I should probably sort of develop my thinking in a way that lets me better communicate, the convictions that I have to those who may disagree with me. And I was a philosophy major, and so I had to pick a specialization. And so I chose ethics. And there were a lot of these positions that I held, which I thought, could be intelligently defended. And in looking in the literature, and this was as I was progressing through my college experience, as I was looking in the literature, there was surprisingly little said in defense of many of these positions. Now, on something like abortion, right? There's been a lot of good work done by philosophers in defense of the pro-life position, arguing that the unborn are people and that it's wrong to take an innocent human life. But on other topics that are not as, I guess, big as abortion, the Christian approach to factory farming or the Christian approach to gun ownership, right? There was surprisingly very little that's been done on that. And so the work that had been done, so I'll take, factory farming, eating meat, for example. Most of the work that had been done when I was surveying the research, when I was surveying the literature, about 90 to 95% of it was in favor of the animal rights position, or the position that animals have serious moral consideration, and therefore that most consumption of meat is immoral. And I thought, well, that doesn't seem right because, one, it doesn't jive with what most people do. It doesn't jive with our moral common sense. And second, a lot of the reasoning here just doesn't seem to hold up if you adopt a classical, philosophical anthropology about what makes man and animals different. A lot of it seems to rely on assumptions or I guess, principles that can be questioned. And so the sort of beginning of my academic research, a lot of it pertained to the moral status of animals, and then also to arguments against homosexual sex. This was around the time of Obergefell and, the Supreme Court decisions about same-sex marriage. And so I thought, well, a lot of that's been written from a Christian perspective to homosexuality. It's been from this, divine command perspective, and not much from a natural law perspective. And so that's also another area where I decided to fill in a gap in the literature. And in general, most of my academic work has been just consisting mainly of filling in gaps of the literature where there is a position that I think is defensible, that jives with, moral common sense most of the time, especially for, Christians, and one in which, no one really has done work on. And so whether it's gun control, drug prohibition, factory farming, I sort of have dedicated my academic career to defending or taking strong positions on moral issues that really hasn't been there hasn't been much written on it from the Christian perspective. So that's just a bit of how I got into the study of ethics.
Yeah, very good. So we'll talk about animal rights shortly, but first I want to talk about gun control, gun rights. You've published a number of articles related to that. You believe that there is a basic moral right to bear arms, including handguns, not just a legal right, but you have defended the idea that there's a basic moral right to bear arms. Could you explain that?
Sure. So I trace everything back to the right to life, the right to stay alive, and the right to flourish. That entails the right to defend yourself from people who intend to take your life away or to interfere with your flourishing. Now, the reality of this world is that, crime thrives on disparity. If you're a criminal, you're going to select somebody who you think you have a good chance of overpowering, of defeating, accomplishing your objective. In that sense, criminals are instrumentally rational. And so there is this inherent disparity in crime that needs to be controlled for. And that's where firearms come in, right? Firearms are, as many have said, the great equalizer. They let someone who is weak, somebody who's small in stature, defend themselves from someone who is stronger, is bigger, and against groups of people even. And so I see the right to own a gun as just an extension of, the right to fight back, which is an extension of the right to stay alive. If you have the right to life, you have the right to self-defense. And if you have the right to self-defense, you have a right to a reasonable means of self-defense. And so I think firearm is a reasonable means of self-defense. Hence, I think there is a strong moral right to own various kinds of firearms for the purpose of protecting yourself.
So what sorts of restrictions on gun ownership do you believe are reasonable if it could be demonstrated statistically that certain restrictions actually had the net effect of saving lives? Would you support those restrictions?
Sure. So a lot of approaches to gun ownership and gun control is sort of motivated by utilitarianism. And utilitarianism is this idea that you basically weigh the consequences, you weigh the empirical data one way, and you see, does a policy cause more more harm through benefits. And then if it causes more, good things and bad things, you go for this one policy, right? And that's a lot of how public policy decisions seem to be made. But I don't think that we should think about rights in that way. I think, rights are inviolable. Rights are especially weighty, even if it would lead to a negative balance of consequences. So, for example, my right to life is weighty in a sense that even if, you could violate my right to life and, harvest my organs to save 5 people, and in doing so, you would save those 5 people, it would still be wrong to intentionally kill me to save 5 people. And so I approach rights not in this kind of balancing test approach. And so if we don't treat the right to life in this way, if it would be wrong to violate my right to life to save 5 people, to harvest my organs, well, any rights that derive from my right to life would also seem to have that weight, including the right to self-defense and the right to a reasonable means of self-defense. And so just because something would result in better consequences for the general population or the general good doesn't mean that you can trample on, my individual rights to do so. And so when it comes to gun restrictions, the number of legal restrictions that I think are justified are going to be very small. I think that one restriction that you could probably justify are restrictions on dangerous possessors, individuals who have shown that they cannot use a firearm effectively or responsibly. So someone who is a domestic abuser or somebody who has a history of reckless use of a firearm. Besides that, though, restrictions on firearm magazine capacity or the type of firearm or, accessories like stocks or, grips, I don't see those as very defensible. And so, which is not to say that there shouldn't be sort of, different criteria, right? It should be easier, I think, to get a handgun than it is to get a machine gun. But ultimately, I do think, when it comes to gun ownership, right? If there is a need for someone to own, say, a select fire weapon, let's say they live in an environment where they face threats from groups of people, I think there's a plausible case to be made for allowing, in those cases, someone to own a select fire weapon. So I don't think you can draw any clear blanket lines on, you can own a semi-automatic weapon, but not a fully automatic weapon. I think a lot of it's going to depend on the kind of threats that are reasonable to expect. And I think in the United States, most, and I guess depending on where you live, right? For me, I think a handgun is going to be enough to deal with most of that I face, right? But also, I mean, there's also the possibility that I may encounter a group of people or a group of people might intend to break into my home. And so I think while a handgun's a good start, I also think that, if I would want to own a modern sporting rifle like the ones I have behind me, I think, I should have the right, individuals should have the right to own something like an AR-15 if they wanted to.
So the principle you seem to be assuming there is that my means of defense, and specifically in the context of guns, should be commensurate with the kinds of threats I might face from a potential attacker.
Yeah, exactly. If I live in the Middle East and I live in danger of group violence, gang violence on a routine basis, I think it's plausible to have access to grenades or a select fire weapon or maybe even a rocket launcher.
Okay. Well, that would be consistent with that principle. That's interesting. Yeah, because this is a objection that sometimes people make. It's a kind of rhetorical move. So, you don't believe in restrictions or most restrictions, so your position would allow for people owning bazookas and flamethrowers or even nuclear weapons. Well, no, there's a principled grounds for drawing the lines there, and it has to do with the nature of likely threats. So would you describe yourself as a political libertarian?
So I've worked for libertarian organizations. I've published in libertarian outlets. I have a very close relationship with many people in the libertarian community. At the end of the day, and I think a lot of what I am saying, in my academic work jives very well with libertarian thinking. But at the end of the day, I would not call myself a libertarian. I identify more as a traditionalist conservative. Libertarians love my work on guns. They love my work on eating meat. They don't like my work on drug prohibition, even though I believe that my work on drug prohibition is consistent with libertarian principles, and I've attempted to explain why I think libertarians should actually defend drug prohibition, because drug use, recreational drug use, actually is incompatible with core libertarian commitments.
All right. So first, define libertarianism, and then explain how your position on recreational drug use is nonetheless consistent with libertarianism.
Sure. So libertarianism is a wide camp like many other political ideologies, but I think the most general way I can give of describing it is that libertarians are committed to individual liberty and the primacy of the individual, autonomy, freedom over, state control, over the community. The individual is sort of the main unit of society for the libertarian. And some libertarians are committed to additional principles. I mean, you have the non-aggression principle, the self-ownership principle, depending on what libertarian you ask, right? But I think most libertarians are going to be united in their commitment to individual liberty, and individual liberty is going to be what really guides their approach to public policy and the laws that we pass. Now, libertarians, for that reason, many libertarians they favor drug legalization because they view drugs or drug use as an extension of individual liberty. This idea of I have the right to do whatever I want to my own body, as long as I don't hurt anyone else, right? And so that's the libertarian justification for drug legalization. That at the end of the day, while it can bleed over to some people, and in those cases, we should intervene. Drug use doesn't have to be that way. It's not necessarily an other regarding action. It's a self-regarding action. My response to that would be, sure, it's a self-regarding action, but what do libertarians care most about? This idea of liberty and to make free decisions, to make genuinely autonomous decisions, you have to be in a position of sound mind. You have to be able to understand what you're choosing. You have to be able to do so voluntarily. You have to be able to have a properly functioning set of cognitive faculties. And what does recreational drug use do? Well, what happens when you get high? Well, your decision making is impaired. Your connection with reality is broken, right? You see things that aren't there. You perceive things that you start hearing things, but you might see illusions, right? You may lose touch with what's actually real. And if your cognitive faculties are distorted, then you can't really make free decisions. You can't really make informed decisions. You can't really make decisions that are grounded in truth, in fact, right? And so for the libertarian, I think, if you care about liberty, right, you should care about that organ, your brain, your cognitive faculties, that helps you make free and autonomous decisions. And in fact, somebody who's under the influence of drugs, right, in a sense, you could say they're a slave to that drug. You could say that they're no longer free. Their decision-making, behavior, I mean, just, ask anyone who has been drunk before, right? Drunk people do stupid things, and, we see them all the time. If you watch police body cam videos, which I like to do, right? Drunk people do really dumb things that they regret when they're sober, right? And so sobriety is an essential condition of genuinely free decision making. If you don't have sobriety, you can't make free decisions. You're in fact a slave to something else, whether it's your feelings, another drug, or whatever, right? And so I think libertarians, if they take liberty seriously, should oppose drug legalization, because drug legalization undercuts the foundations for free decision making. So that's my libertarian argument against drug legalization.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's ingenious. In fact, before I encountered your article, which I've used in ethics classes I've taught before, just that angle of approach, that whole rationale had never occurred to me. We all want, in a free society, it's in everybody's best interest to have a sober electorate, right? That the populace who are voting on various public propositions and different officials for elected offices need to be sober-minded and cognitively alert as possible. So I think that's a great argument. Now, what would you say to this question? I don't know if it's an objection, but it would press you for consistency. Do you believe that smoking tobacco should likewise be illegal?
Yes, I do believe it should be illegal, but not for the same reason as just recreational drug use in general. So it's possible to, I don't smoke, so I'm speaking off what I've seen, right?
Or
It's
maybe
possible.
your response could be like mine when people ask me if I smoke. Not many people ask me. If someone asks me, do you smoke? I say yes, but only when I'm on fire.
There you go. So the way I approach tobacco is similar, but not the same as I would approach something like marijuana. My argument against tobacco is that just it's inherently damaging. I think that tobacco, there's no good use for it. There's no good purpose for smoking that would outweigh the negative harms to your body. And so I think there's a case to be made for outlawing tobacco. It'd be a different case than, say, banning marijuana or any other, psychoactive substance. I don't believe tobacco is psychoactive. And so the argument for that would be sort of a different argument. The argument that I give, and so some people bring up this argument that, if you think that recreational drugs should be illegal, then any other substance that causes harm by that extension should also be illegal. And so you have this over-criminalization objection, which that's a common objection to anti-drug arguments, but it doesn't apply to my argument because what's doing the work in my argument against drug legalization is the fact that those drugs are psychoactive. They impair your cognition. And that's really the focus of my argument there. Now, you may have reasons to restrict or not restrict drugs or substances that are not psychoactive, right? But I narrowly tailor my argument to psychoactive substances to precisely avoid the objection that it would lead to overcriminalization. So I think there's something to be said for banning tobacco and perhaps, other things that are dangerous. It would be a different argument than the argument that I offer against the legalization of recreational drugs, which is based on their psychoactive and their impairing effect on decision making.
Okay, very good. Some have also argued, and maybe you would augment your argument in this way, that because of all of the diseases, heart disease, lung disease, cancers that tobacco causes, that has the net effect of raising insurance rates for everybody, right? Think about medical insurance and how much money is spent in the medical industry treating these sorts of diseases that are a consequence of tobacco use. You could make a more indirect argument based on the harm principle for making tobacco usage illegal. Do you think that works?
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to that kind of argument. There's an article by J. Angelo Corlett where he basically makes a similar argument where he says, a lot of illicit substances have negative externalities and they impose costs on other people, even if, you could have individual cases of somebody using in their own home and not in that moment affecting anyone, there is still going to be some kind of negative externality, whether it's in lost productivity or something else, right? And so you can make that harm argument. In general, I think harm arguments can be viable, but I'm skeptical of harm arguments, just whether it's for one thing or another, just because it's hard to screen off that over-criminalization objection. So I like to narrowly tailor, and libertarians aren't going to be a fan of harm arguments in general. So I try to make my arguments as broad basis as possible. And that's also just a general trend in my work. I try to, and in some cases you kind of have to appeal to things that are controversial in like a Rawlsian sense. But I try to make my arguments as appealing to as broadly accessible as possible, such that it's really hard to find something that, you could disagree with from any political spectrum. And so harm arguments, I think, are arguments that a lot of people find have weight, but libertarians don't. And so I try to shy away from harm arguments in general, because the moment you bring up harm, alarm bells go off in libertarian.
Okay, so let's turn our attention to the whole animal rights issue. A standard argument for not just animal rights, but the immorality of eating meat is that the whole factory farming or industrial farming system, for which we get most of our meat, is inherently cruel or inhumane. But you challenge this. What's your reasoning on that?
Yeah, so there is a very influential kind of reasoning in animal rights circles, and I use the term animal rights just to refer broadly to people who think animals have serious moral status, because I think someone listening to this might quibble and say, well, I don't believe animals have rights. I believe they have serious moral status, like someone like Peter Singer, for example. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to lump those categories together. Someone in that category would say that they'd endorse this minimalist argument whereby, animals can feel pain, and all you need for moral status is the ability to feel pain. If you feel pain, that means you matter in some way. And if you matter in some way, right, you have moral status. And the pleasure you get from eating meat does not outweigh the moral status that, animals, whether lower animals, higher animals, or human beings have. And so there's this argument that I encountered early on in, my undergraduate years. I thought it was a really powerful argument, right? All you need in the argument is that the ability to feel pain is a condition for having serious moral standing. And if you grant that, then a lot of what the animal rights camp, makes sense. And so my response has been actually to challenge that premise. I think that the ability to feel pain can definitely enhance the welfare conditions of someone who already has moral status, but I don't think that the ability to feel pain, sentience, I don't think that property in itself confers any kind of meaningful moral status, and here's why. The ability to feel pain is just a welfare condition. It's just one way in which a being can flourish or have its life go well or ill. It doesn't really add anything to, it doesn't really show how that has moral consideration. Determine what counts as relevant to having moral status, you need to look at the concept of moral status to begin with, right? What does it mean to have moral standing or standing as part of the moral community? Well, reflect on the concept of morality, right? Morality is about right and wrong, making moral decisions. It's about reasoning in a certain way. And so moral beings are beings that have the capacity to make judgments about right and wrong and to act on those judgments. If something can't do that, then it doesn't count as a moral being. Now, being able to feel pain definitely enhances the life of a being that's able to make those moral decisions. And so, sentience does sort of enhance, I guess you could say, the welfare of a moral being, but sentience in itself is just a welfare condition. And so animals obviously can't feel pain. I've had some people accuse me of saying that, well, you're saying animals can't feel pain. No, I don't believe that. I think animals do feel pain. I do think they can, the evidence for that is just, obvious. I'm not a Cartesian, but I don't think that ability to feel pain confers moral standing. And so I think factory farming is not inherently wrong because it doesn't violate the moral status. We don't hold animals accountable for killing each other. We don't hold animals accountable for predation. We don't hold animals accountable for the things they do because they don't know any better, right? Which is not to say that animals aren't capable of very complex kinds of mental activity. It's just that that kind of mental activity is not the kind of mental activity relevant to moral decision making. So as far as factory farming is concerned, it can be wrong for contingent reasons, right? Maybe you have a particular setup in which the people who partake in it are corrupted, right? That's definitely a possibility. And, there are many facilities in the world where I'm sure it's not probably factory farming is not carried out in a way that reflects, human dignity when it comes to, taking care of nature and such. But I don't think factory farming is inherently cruel. I don't think it's inherently cruel to confine animals in small cages. I don't think it's inherently cruel to basically manufacture these operations on an industrial basis. It can be wrong contingently, but, if done properly, I think factory farming is great. Factory farming feeds a lot of people. Factory farming is a great source of food, which I can see now many vegans and vegetarians, just raging at me over the screen, but that's a position that I've taken, and I think it's a defensible one.
So, given your criteria for moral standing, couldn't one argue like this, an objection that, it really proves too much? And in particular, let's think about how that applies to, say, a human fetus 4, 5, 6 months in, or even in the third trimester. There's no reasoning. This is a being that is not conscious. There's no self-motivated activity, much less a capacity for moral thought. So how do you get around the implication that your argument here actually lays the foundation for a strongly pro-choice position on the abortion issue?
Sure, that's going to be the most common objection, and it's known I don't like the name for this, but it's the name that I guess has been adopted in the literature. It's called the argument from marginal cases, right? The argument is that, well, if you think that reasoning and such is required for moral standing, well, there are so-called marginal humans that don't have those abilities and so would be excluded under your criteria. And my response would be to say that, well, there are no marginal humans. I don't like that term because it seems to suggest like a gradation. The way that I've articulated this in my research is that the moral status depends on, an underlying capacity to think, right? Moral status attaches to beings, and beings, exercise powers. And so what matters to moral status is whether you're a certain kind of being with the power or capacity, disposition, ability, whatever you want to use, to exercise a certain kind of ability. Now, just because you're not exercising a certain power doesn't mean you don't have that power to begin with. It's just not being used, right? When I'm sleeping, if I'm knocked out cold, if I'm in a temporary coma, right? I'm not in the moment reasoning, but I retain my moral status because I'm a certain kind of substance that has that power inherent within me. Now, when it comes to, say, a fetus or an embryo, that power of reasoning is there from the very beginning. The physical sort of hardware to express that power is not active yet, it's not developed yet, but it doesn't mean that power is not there. I mean, the very reason why a fetus or embryo develops in the law-like way that they do is because those powers are sort of guiding its development towards a manifestation. If those powers weren't there, or those capacities weren't there, then it would be inexplicable why human development occurs in the way that it does. And so I think that human beings, from the earliest moment of that human being's existence, which is conception, human beings from the earliest moment of their existence have serious moral standing because they have this inherent power to reason. By inherent power, some people make the argument that, well, are you going to treat a child as, an adult because they're a potential adult? That's not quite my argument. My argument is not, but when I talk about potential or a capacity, I'm talking about a power that's really actually there to begin with. It's just not expressed. It's not manifested. The sort of physical hardware needed for that to occur has not developed, but it doesn't mean it's not there. And so I think, because moral status attaches to beings, right, you have to look at the kind of being something is, and power is attached to beings, right? And so we don't look at the actual manifestation of a power or a capacity or an ability or whatever it is. We look at what kind of thing one is. And all human beings are of a substance that's rational. But no animal is like that, right? No chimpanzee, no dolphin. Right? You don't see animals, no matter how much you teach them, how much they develop. You don't see animals writing books. You don't see animals, putting out poetry. You don't see civilization, right? You don't see the kind of conceptual reasoning needed to articulate, concepts like truth and falsity, or good and bad, or right and wrong. That's just not present in the animal world. But human beings have it, even if they can't manifest it at that moment. So that would be my response to the so-called marginal cases argument.
Yeah, very good. So would you ground the right to life, the human right to life, in what you've just been talking about, these ultimate capacities, or in something else?
So yeah, I think approximately, right? Your right to life. I think rights presuppose responsibility. So I think we have the right to life because we have the responsibility to flourish. And I think that responsibility comes from our being rational creatures. Now, ultimately, as a Christian, I think all of that goes back to the way we're created in the image of God. But proximately, right, our rights go back to the kind of being we are. And the kind of being we are, it goes back to the way we're created in God's image as being rational agents.
So would you say that all of this, when it comes down to human rights and duties, ultimately the proper moral foundation is a theological one, and specifically the nature of God?
Yeah, and something that I think is missing in a lot of contemporary rights discourse is this idea of responsibilities, especially among libertarians. Rights are sort of a shield. That's one metaphor that's been given for they protect us as we go about our flourishing. But the reason we have rights is because we're built in a certain way to understand, truth, to understand falsity, to understand good and bad, right and wrong, to act in certain ways that unfold what we are meant to do. And so I think, this idea of rights goes back to responsibilities, and these responsibilities reflect the way we are created in the image of God to sort of, go out in the world, to subdue it, to be stewards of the world, and to exercise, the capacities that we've been given. So ultimately, it goes back to a theological foundation where, we bear God's image and we are to act in ways that reflect that image. That's why rights are just not, they're not like just a free thing we get that comes with no strings attached. Rights are, and this is also another area where I would depart from a lot of libertarian thinking. I don't think you have a right to do wrong. Rights protect us as we flourish. Rights don't protect us to do whatever we want. Rights are essential condition. Rights exist because we're meant to do certain things and we have to be protected as we do those things. So all of this goes back ultimately to a theological foundation that I think is unescapable.
Right. Even though so many people in our culture, including thought leaders, major scholars in ethics and political philosophy and so on, will talk so freely regarding human rights and help themselves to these concepts and ideas, when if they really are properly theologically grounded, if they ultimately are bestowed upon us by our Creator in whose image we're made, then to just glibly appeal to human rights without acknowledging that theological foundation, it's borrowed capital, isn't it? So thinking about that, your Christian theology and how it informs what you do, do you think of yourself as having a divine calling to be the sort of professional Christian ethicist that you are?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that ultimately, everything that occurs is under the control of God. Nothing happens without God either allowing it or ordaining it to be so. And where I'm at right now, I do think that with all the work that I've done, with all the, I guess, sort of attention that I've received, I think that this is a, part of why I've been put on this earth. I also do other things. I'm in law enforcement. I'm a father. I'm a husband. I think those are also other vocations and callings that I have. I think that God made everyone to use their minds, right? And this is just me using my mind in service of the gospel. It's me using my mind in service of the truth. And, each person has a different calling, but I think, based on the sort of circumstances that have occurred in my life, I think that the work that I've done, the positions that I've held, I think, it's not without a coincidence, right? I mean, I can point to many different things that have occurred throughout my time in academia that I look back on. It's always looking back, right? I look back and I'm like, this is something that I just can't explain away as a coincidence. How I got into academia, how I was able to get a job in academia, and despite the fact that I defend very unpopular positions, and I'm sure, as the job market for philosophers is abysmal. I was able to get a good position without too much difficulty. So, I think a lot of what I've done has been put before me for a reason. Now, where I'm at right now, I'm sort of halfway in academia and halfway in law enforcement. So I'm really curious to see what exactly my path is right now in the future, what the Lord has planned for me. But I don't think it's to stop doing philosophy completely. I'm still writing. I still have some ideas I want to get out there, but I'll go wherever the Lord leads me.
That's great. Yeah. And you say, looking back in retrospect, things do become a lot clearer. And I've noticed in my own life, and I predict you will notice the same if you haven't already, just how what seem to be detours or pointless dead ends, temporary dead ends, and just strange developments in terms of your professional career eventually coalesce into a very clear divine purpose and plan that can be rather surprising and encouraging. So you are a unique bird to be operating in both of those areas. I think it's inspiring. You might be the only one in the country, one of the very few that are doing that. But I would not be surprised if it culminates in something that is very significant, that where you end up leveraging your backgrounds in both areas in very significant ways. So keep an eye out for that. It would be just the sort of thing that Providence does. So the question I like to conclude all of our conversations with is this, and it's the ultimate question for philosophers. And actually, even though philosophers get tagged with being concerned with this, it concerns everybody. And that is your conception of the ultimate meaning of life. What is your view of the ultimate meaning of life? And how is your work a manifestation of your view on your life's purpose?
Sure. So as a Christian, I take the scriptures very seriously. I take my Christian convictions very seriously. And although most of my work has focused on articulating positions consistent with Christianity in a way that doesn't appeal to, explicitly theological motives, right? At the end of the day, everyone is under the jurisdiction of God. Everyone is made in God's image. Everyone is sort of accountable to God in the end. And so there's no getting out of, the divinely appointed purpose of why we exist. And I think that ultimately is, God makes everyone so that we may come to know him. We may come to understand who he is, what he has done, and that, God wishes that everyone comes to salvation, right? And so I think, for everyone, it comes back to this idea of God wants us to know who he is and to follow him, to love him, and to worship him. We know another person. And so I think it's within everyone's blueprint that come to knowledge of God and saving knowledge of God too. And if not, then, there is accountability for that in the end. But as someone who believes that everyone's made in the image of God, that's what we're made for. You, me, and even, everyone else in the world who doesn't believe.
Thank you. That's good. Well, Tim, I appreciate you, all the work that you're doing. Thank you for spending this time with us, and keep it up, my friend.
Thanks. Appreciate you having me.
Thank you for listening to the Kalos Center podcast. We gave you our thoughts. Now let us know what you think. Email us at podcast@kalos.center.